In the last lecture, we learned what is a service and why we need a service in an Angular application. We learned that a service is a TypeScript class which contains a piece of code which can be reused throughout the Angular application. So a service provides reusability of code in Angular. Now in this lecture, let's go ahead and create a very simple service and use it in our Angular application. For that, I have created a very simple Angular application. This Angular application, it is just like the first example which we saw in our previous lecture. So in this application, we have three main components. The first component is this header component. Then we also have a hero component, this component, and we have a sidebar component. And in each of these three components, we have a subscribe button. So we have a subscribe button in header component, we have a subscribe button in sidebar component, and we also have a subscribe button in hero component. Now here, our requirement is such that whenever one of these subscribe buttons is clicked by the user, we want to subscribe the user to this web application. In simple words, whenever any one of these subscribe buttons is clicked, we want to execute the subscribe logic. So let's first see how we will have to do it without services. Let's go to VS Code, and in there I have created a new project. I'm calling it Angular Service and Dependency Injection. In this project, if I expand this source folder, in there we have our app folder, and in the app folder I have the header component. So first we have app component, and then we have the header component, and the header component is the child component for app component. So if I go to the web page, this component which you see here, it is the header component. If I expand this header component, in there we have two more components. We have admin component and we have home component. So this admin component and home component, it is the child of this header component. Now we will talk about admin component later. We don't need it in this lecture, but let's go to this home component. So if I expand this home component, and this home component, it represents this complete area here after the header. And in that home component, we have two other components. We have a hero component. So this hero component here, it represents the left side of the home component. So basically this content, it is coming from hero component. And then we also have sidebar component. So the sidebar component here is this right hand side content. So this content here, it is coming from sidebar component. Okay, and both sidebar component and hero component, it is the child component of home component. Okay, so hero and sidebar, it is the child component of home component. So in this lecture, we are going to work with three components. We are going to work with header component. So we have a subscribe button within the header component, and we also have a subscribe button in hero component and sidebar component. Now, just to make things easier, I will show you how the component tree of this Angular application looks like. So this is how the component tree of that Angular application looks like. At the top, we have app component. In that app component, we have header component. This header component has two child components, the home component and the admin component. And then the home component has two child components, hero component and sidebar component. And this admin component has one child component, this user detail component. Now we will talk about this admin component and user detail component in the future lecture of this course. Let's now focus on this header component and also on the hero and sidebar component. So we saw that we have the subscribe button in this header component, and we also have subscribe buttons in this hero component and this sidebar component. So first, let's go ahead and let's implement the subscription logic for the subscribe button of header component. Let's go to VS Code. In there, let's go to header component and let's go to header component.html. So what we want is, when this subscribe button is clicked, we want to execute subscription logic. So on this button, we are going to bind click event. And we have that button here. So on this button, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. And when the click event happens, I'm going to call a method on subscribe. Now let's go ahead and let's create this method in the header component class. So let's open header component class. In there, we already have two methods, home clicked and admin clicked. Now we will not worry about it right now. Let's go ahead and let's create on subscribe method. And when the subscribe button is clicked, we want to execute some subscribe logic. In that subscribe logic, we might want to add the user to the database. Then we might want to send subscription email with the subscription details to the user. Then we might also want to allow user to access our services. For example, let's say if we are creating a streaming service like Netflix, then once the user has subscribed, we might also want to allow the user to go through the movies or TV series which he wants to watch. So that is the service Netflix is providing. So once we have added the user to the database, we have sent the subscription detail to the user, then we also want to allow user to access the services. Now here I'm not going to write the logic for these steps. These logics we are not going to write because here in this lecture our main focus is to understand how we can create a service and what is the advantage of using a service. Right, in this lecture we are not going to worry about adding the user to the database or sending him the email or anything like that. Here we are mainly going to focus on what is a service and how we can use it. So to keep things simple, what I will do is after the logic of adding the user to the database, sending email to the user, and allowing user to access the service, after all these logics have been executed, we also want to show the user a notification saying that you have been subscribed. For that, I'm simply going to use this alert function and I want to show that message to the user using the alert window. So here I'll simply say, thank you for subscribing. You can access the services now. Okay. So if I save the changes here and if we go to the web page now and if I click on the subscribe button, you will notice that an alert window has been displayed here with the message, thank you for subscribing. You can access the services now. So here when the subscribe button is clicked, we are executing the subscription logic. Now we want to do the same thing for these two buttons as well. So when this subscribe button is clicked, that time also we want to execute the subscription logic and show the alert window. And when this subscribe button is clicked, that time also we want to subscribe the user and we want to show the alert window. But currently these two buttons are not working. So for that what we need to do is, again, we need to bind click event on these two buttons and then write the same logic and execute it. So this subscribe now button is present in hero component. Now if I go back to VS Code and if I open hero component, for that we have to go to home component and in there we have the hero component. Okay, so in the hero component also we need to write the same logic. So I'll copy this function from here. Let's close this header component and let's open hero component.html. And there also we have this subscribe button. On that button first we need to bind the click event. Okay, and to that click event we are going to call on subscribe method. And let's go to hero component.ts and in there let's go ahead and let's create that method. So if you notice here also we are writing the same logic which we have written in the header component. So here we have the same onSubscribe method. In that onSubscribe method we are executing the same logic of subscription, and whenever the subscribe button of hero component will be clicked, we are calling that onSubscribe method. So if I go back to the web page, now this subscribe now button should also be working. So when I click on the subscribe now button, now you can see we have this alert window with the message, thank you for subscribing, you can access the services now. If I click on this subscribe button, there also we have the same message. Let's do the same thing for this subscribe now button. Now this subscribe now button is present in sidebar component. So let's again go back to VS Code. Let me close this hero component.html here and let's open sidebar component. So again, I'll open the HTML file first. There on the button element, let's bind click event. And to this click event, we are going to bind on subscribe method. And let's go ahead and let's create this method in the sidebar component class. And you will notice that we are writing the same subscribe logic in the sidebar component also. With this, we save the changes. If we go to the web page, now this subscribe button should also be working. So when I click here, you can see that an alert window with the same message that has been displayed here. So now for all these three buttons, we are executing this subscribe logic. Okay, but the problem here is if I go back to VS Code, let me close this HTML file here and let me also open header.ts file. So you will notice that in the header component class, we have the same subscription logic. In the sidebar class, we have the same subscription logic. And in the hero component class also, we have the same subscription logic. So here we are repeating the same logic in three different components. And in this way, we are violating the dry principle. That means do not repeat yourself. And this is not an efficient way of developing the application. In this example, we have only three components where we need the subscription logic. But let's say in our application, there are some more components where we need to use that same subscription logic, then we will have to write that subscription logic again in those component classes. And again, we will be repeating the same code. So this is a very big problem here. Here, we are violating the dry principle. We are repeating the same code again and again in our Angular application. Another problem is, as we learned in the last lecture, in the component class, we should be only writing the UI logics. We should not be writing the business logic. But this onSubscribe method, it contains a business logic. It has nothing to do with the UI. So here we are mixing the UI logic with the business logic. And that is another bad practice while developing a front-end application. Now, to solve this problem, what we can do is we can make use of services. So let's go ahead and let's create a simple service and let's see how it allows us to solve all these problems. So let me go ahead and let me retract these folders. Okay. And in the app folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call this folder services. Inside this services folder, I'm going to create a new service file. I'm going to call this service file subscribe.service. So the convention here while creating a service file is that your service file must contain .service. So when we create a component, we say component name dot component. When we create a directive, we use directive name dot directive. In the same way, when we create a service, we should have the service name dot service. And then a service file is nothing but a TypeScript file. So here the extension should be .ts. Now in the last lecture we learned that a service is nothing but a TypeScript class. So in order to create a service, all we have to do is we have to create a class. So let's go ahead and let's create a class. For that we can use this class keyword and we are going to call this class subscribe service. And we also want to use this class in other files. For that we also need to export it. Now, when we create a component, we decorate it with @component decorator. When we create a directive, we decorate it with @directive decorator. But in case of a service class, we do not decorate it with any decorator. A service class is just a simple TypeScript class. And inside this class, we can write all those logics which we might reuse in our Angular application. For example, this subscribe logic. So let me go ahead and let me copy this logic from here and I will write this logic inside the subscribe service class. Okay. In the same way, in this subscribe service, we can also write other subscription related logic. For example, on unsubscribe or maybe renew subscription, something like that. But for now, we are going to only keep one method, this onSubscribe method. And actually, I'm going to call it onSubscribe clicked. Okay, so when the subscribe button is clicked, that time only we want to execute this logic and then we want to show this alert window. Now we have a subscribe service class. In that subscribe service class, we have this onSubscribe clicked method which contains the subscription logic. So now what we can do is we can reuse this onSubscribe clicked method in all those components where we need to execute the subscription logic. For example, if I go to this header component class, there we need to execute the subscription logic. So instead of writing that subscription logic here, what I will do is I will remove this subscription logic from here. And in here, I will instantiate this subscribe service class. And to instantiate that subscribe service class, let's create a variable. Let's call it maybe subservice. And in order to instantiate a class, in order to create an object of a class, first we use new keyword followed by the class name. Now here, the class name is subscribe service. And in order to use this subscribe service, we also need to import it from this subscribe service file. So when I press enter, it will be automatically imported at the top. And after the class name, we need to use a set of parentheses. Okay, so in this way, we are creating an instance of the subscribe service class. And once we have an instance of that subscribe service class, on that instance, we can go ahead and we can call this onSubscribe clicked method. So in here, I I can simply say subservice dot on subscribe clicked. Currently, this subscribe service method, it is not taking any parameters. So that's why we are not passing any argument here. But a service method can also take some parameter. And just to show you that, what I will do is I will also include a parameter here, maybe type. It is going to be of type string. This is not required, but I just want to show you here that we can also pass parameter to the service method. Okay, so here we are going to receive the type, and here I'm going to use that type parameter in this alert message. So here I will say thank you for your, and then I'm going to use the type parameter here, and after that I'll say subscription. Okay, now when we are calling this on subscribe clicked method from the header component, we need to pass a value for this type parameter. So there I am going to pass a string value, maybe monthly. If I save the changes, if we go to the web page, and now when I click on this subscribe button, what it will do is, since to this subscribe button we have binded click event. So if I open header component.html, there we are binding this click event, and when the click event happens, we are going to call this on subscribe method. If I go to header component class, there we are defining this on subscribe method. So when this on subscribe method will be called, first it will create an instance of the subscribe service class, and then it is going to call the on subscribe clicked method of that subscribe service class. And to that method, we are passing the value for the type parameter as monthly. So again, if we go back and if we click on this subscribe button, you will notice that the message says, thank you for your monthly subscription. You can access these services now. Okay. Now let's go ahead and let's do the same thing for this subscribe now button of hero component. So let's go back. Let me copy these two lines of code, and let me close this header component.html, and let's go to this hero component.ts. And in there, from this on subscribe method, I will remove all these subscription logics. Now we are going to use the subscription logic from the subscribe service class. But in order to use that subscription logic in this hero component class, first we need to instantiate the subscribe service class. And in order to use this subscribe service class inside this hero component, we also need to import it. So I'll also go ahead and I'll copy that import statement. Okay. And let me go ahead and let me paste it here. Now here, currently we are in the hero component, right? And hero component is present inside the home component. So when we say dot dot slash, from the hero component, we have moved to home component. Now from the home component, we also need to move to header component. And from the header component, we need to move to app component. And then in the app component, in the app folder, we have this service folder. And in there, we have the subscribe service. Okay, so now we are able to access this subscribe service class from this file. So when the subscribe button will be clicked, this on subscribe method will be called. There we are creating an instance of this subscribe service, and on that instance we are calling this on subscribe clicked method, and there we are passing a value for the type parameter. But here, instead of saying monthly, let's say yearly. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page, and now this subscribe button should also be working. So if I click on this subscribe button now, it says thank you for your yearly subscription. So this yearly, we passed it as an argument for the type parameter. When I click on this subscribe button, it says thank you for your monthly subscription. All right, now let's do the same thing for this third subscribe button as well. So again, let's go back and let's copy these two lines of code. Let's go to sidebar component, and from there, from the on subscribe method, let's remove this subscription logic, because now we are going to use this subscription logic from the subscribe service. And in order to reuse that logic, first we need to create an instance of this subscribe service class, and then on that instance we can call this on subscribe clicked method. Again, in order to use this subscribe service class, we need to first import it. So again, I'll copy this import statement. I'll go back to sidebar component, and there I'll paste it. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and here for the type parameter, instead of saying yearly, let me pass quarterly. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page, and now when I click on this subscribe button, it says thank you for your quarterly subscription. So now the subscription logic is getting executed for this subscribe button also. Okay, so what we are doing here is whenever any one of these three subscribe buttons is clicked, we are going to execute a subscription logic, and we are writing that subscription logic in the subscribe service class in here. And then we are reusing this logic, this piece of code in hero component. We are reusing it in side component, and we are reusing it in header component. We are not writing the subscription logic in the component class now. We are writing it in the service class. And then we are reusing that logic in different components. And this is the main use of a service. A service in Angular allows us to reuse a piece of code. And when we have used a service class like this, we have also separated the business logic from the UI logic. So now we are not writing any business logic in the component class. Component class now, it only contains the UI logic. All right, so I hope with this simple example, now it is clear to you what is a service and what do we use a service for. Now, before I wrap up this lecture, there is one more thing which I want to talk about here. So here, if you notice in these components, for example, in this hero component, in this sidebar component, and in this header component, in order to reuse the on subscribe clicked method of the subscribe service, what we are doing is we are creating an instance of subscribe service class. And once we have that instance created, on that instance, we are calling the on subscribe clicked method. Now, when we are creating an instance of this subscribe service class by our own in this hero component class, what we are doing is we are making this hero component class dependent on this subscribe service class. So if for some reason the subscribe service class is removed or it is modified, it will affect this hero component class. In that case, this hero component class might not work properly. So here, when we are explicitly instantiating this service class, we are making the component class tightly coupled with that service class. And it is not a good practice. Instead, what we can do here is we can ask Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class to this hero component class. And we can use that injected instance. Instead of creating an instance by ourselves, we can ask Angular to provide an instance of this service class, and then we can use that instance in this component class. And that is called as dependency injection. So in the next lecture, we will see what is dependency injection and how we can ask Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this hero component as well as inside the sidebar component and header component.